In the frostbitten reaches of the northern woods, where the snow blankets the earth in a suffocating silence and the wind howls like the cries of the damned, there lay a village isolated from the rest of the world. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the surrounding forest, especially during the harsh winter months when food was scarce and the shadow of hunger loomed large. The story begins in late November, as the first heavy snows began to fall, blanketing the village in white. Emily, a young journalist from the city, had traveled to the village to gather stories of ancient legends and forgotten folklore. Her interest was particularly piqued by the legend of the Wendigo, a creature said to be born from the depths of winter and human desperation. Emily had arranged to stay with the Martins, a local family who had lived in the village for generations. The Martins were a wealth of knowledge about local lore, and Emily was eager to learn what she could. "Be careful around the woods," Mr. Martin warned Emily as they sat around the fireplace one chilly evening. "The Wendigo is no mere story to frighten children. It's a reminder of the darkness that hunger can bring." Emily, wrapped in a warm blanket, scribbled down notes. "Has anyone actually seen the Wendigo?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. Mrs. Martin exchanged a worried glance with her husband before responding. "Not seen and lived to tell the tale," she whispered. "But every few winters, when the game is scarce, strange things happen. People go missing, and sometimes, you can hear it, the Wendigo's call, a sound like the breaking of bones." Over the next few days, Emily explored the village and the edges of the forest, her curiosity driving her deeper into the lore. The villagers she interviewed shared hushed, fearful stories of encounters with the Wendigo, a beast of insatiable hunger, always craving human flesh. Driven by a growing obsession, Emily decided to venture into the forest. She prepared her backpack with supplies and borrowed a camera, determined to capture evidence of the Wendigo's existence or debunk the myths once and for all. As she stepped into the forest, the silence enveloped her. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, the park quickly disappearing behind her as the snow continued to fall. She walked for hours, her breath forming clouds of vapor in the freezing air, her footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the forest, startling her. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, but saw nothing but the dense trees and falling snow. Shaking off her nerves, she continued, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. As dusk began to fall, Emily realized she had gone too far. The path back was unclear, the landmarks covered by the snow. Panic set in as she wandered, trying to find her way back, but the forest seemed to shift around her, disorienting her further. Then she heard it, a low, mournful wail that twisted her stomach with fear. It was followed by a series of cracks, like breaking branches or bones. The sounds were getting closer. She turned in circles, her flashlight beam darting through the trees, revealing nothing but more shadows. Exhausted, terrified, and lost, Emily found a small clearing and decided to wait out the night. She built a small fire, the flames casting eerie shadows that danced between the trees. She tried to stay awake, her eyes scanning the darkness. That's when she saw it, two glowing eyes, reflecting the firelight from the edge of the clearing. They disappeared and reappeared, moving closer each time. Emily grabbed her camera, her hands shaking as she aimed it towards the eyes, and snapped a picture. The flash illuminated the forest for a brief moment, revealing a glimpse of a gaunt, humanoid figure with matted hair and elongated limbs, before it vanished into the darkness. Terrified, Emily huddled by the fire, keeping watch. The night was filled with sounds, whispers carried by the wind, the crackling of frozen branches, and the faint echo of a wail. She felt a deep, gnawing hunger that seemed to grow with every hour, a hunger that reminded her of the stories of the Wendigo's curse. As dawn broke, the forest remained silent. Emily packed her things and began to search for the way out, her mind replaying the night's horrors. She stumbled upon a path, marked by unfamiliar footprints that were too large to be human, leading deeper into the woods. Curiosity overcame her fear. She followed the prints, her camera ready, the legend of the Wendigo no longer just a story, but a chilling reality that beckoned her further into the shadowy depths of the forest. The footprints led to a cave partially hidden by thickets of gnarled branches and underbrush. The air was colder here, the atmosphere suffused with an ominous silence that seemed to pulse with hidden life. Emily's breath formed thick clouds of mist as she approached, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it echoing in her ears. The cave mouth was a dark moor, beckoning her inward. With trembling hands, she pointed her flashlight into the abyss, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing slick, ice-covered walls that glistened like the inside of a beast's mouth. She hesitated at the threshold, the stories of the Wendigo swirling in her mind, a creature born from cannibalism, embodying the starkest of human desperation and hunger. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped inside. The air inside the cave was frigid, the silence oppressive. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed the walls were etched with primitive symbols, twisting, agonized figures that seemed to writhe under her flashlight's beam. Each step deeper into the cave felt like a descent into madness. Her logical mind screamed for her to turn back, but the pull of the story, the need to know, drove her forward. As she ventured deeper, the cave narrowed, forcing her to squeeze through tight passages, the cold stone scraping against her coat. The narrow passage suddenly opened into a larger chamber, where the air was thick with the smell of decay. Emily gagged, covering her mouth with her scarf. Her flashlight revealed a horrific tableau, the remains of various creatures, both animals and disturbingly human-like forms, were scattered across the floor, some fresh, some old and gnawed upon. The realization hit her with chilling force. This was a feeding den. The Wendigo's lair. Heart racing, she turned to leave, but a sound stopped her, a soft, pained whimpering from the far corner of the chamber. Slowly, Emily turned her flashlight toward the noise. There, among the bones and detritus, lay a figure, huddled and shivering. It was a man, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt and pale, eyes wide with terror and recognition. "Help me," he croaked as Emily approached, her every instinct screaming to flee yet compelled to help. "Please, don't let it come back." "Who are you? How did you get here?" Emily asked, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him, assessing his wounds. "I was hunting," he whispered, his voice a raspy shadow of fear. "Chasing a legend. I wanted to prove it was just a story." His voice trailed off as he coughed, his body racked with pain. Emily quickly rifled through her backpack for her first aid kit, her hands shaking as she tried to tend to his wounds. As she worked, the man's fearful eyes kept darting to the dark passages leading out of the chamber. "It comes back," he muttered, a delirious mix of warning and plea. "It feeds at night. It's hungry, always so hungry." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as the man's words echoed the stories Mr. and Mrs. Martin had told her. She needed to get out, get both of them out before it returned. She helped the man to his feet, supporting his weight as they began the slow, painful journey back through the narrow passage. But as they neared the entrance of the cave, a terrible, bone-chilling howl reverberated through the cave. The sound was otherworldly, filled with hunger and rage. Emily froze, her eyes wide with terror. The howl was answered by another, then another, until the air was thick with their calls. "They know we're here," the man whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "They're calling to each other." Emily's mind raced. The stories had never mentioned more than one Wendigo. But the howls suggested a pack, a thought too horrifying to contemplate. She helped the man move faster, ignoring the pain in her own limbs, driven by the primal need to survive. They emerged from the cave just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the snow. The forest was eerily quiet, the silence now a menacing threat. With no time to waste, Emily helped the man through the thick snow, her mind alert to any sound, any movement. As they trudged through the snow, Emily thought of the camera still hanging around her neck. She stopped briefly, turning to take a photo of the cave entrance. It was a compulsion to document, to prove the reality of what they had faced. But as the flash illuminated the twilight, a figure appeared at the mouth of the cave, a tall, gaunt silhouette, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Emily gasped, snapping another photo before hurrying on, supporting the injured man. The forest around them seemed to close in, the darkness growing deeper, the cold more biting. As they moved, the air filled with the cacophony of howls, closer now, a symphony of hunger and despair. Each step became a desperate struggle against the encroaching darkness and the bone-chilling fear that gripped Emily's heart. The injured man leaned heavily on her, his breaths ragged and labored, his every step an act of sheer will. The shadows of the trees seemed to twist and move, animated by the flickering light of Emily's dying flashlight. Her mind raced with panic as she envisioned the Wendigos closing in, drawn by their scent, by the fear that saturated the air. "We have to keep moving," Emily urged the man, her voice barely above a whisper. The terror of the situation lent her a strength she didn't know she possessed, propelling her forward through the deep snow, her legs aching with the effort. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, spiked their fear to new heights. The howls grew louder, more fervent, as if the creatures were communicating, strategizing their hunt. Emily's mind conjured images of the Wendigos, gaunt, withered creatures with elongated limbs and sunken eyes, bodies twisted by starvation and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The man stumbled, his weight nearly dragging Emily down with him. "I can't," he gasped, his face contorted with pain and exhaustion. "It's too much." "No?" Emily's response was fierce, almost primal. "We're not stopping. We can't stop. You have to move." With Herculean effort, they continued, each step a battle against the cold and their own bodies. The forest around them seemed endless, each tree a mocking spectre in the dim light of her flashlight. As they trudged on, a particularly loud howl pierced the night, so close it seemed right upon them. Instinctively, Emily turned her head, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, she saw it, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its eyes a pair of glowing embers in the shadowed underbrush. The creature stood still, observing them, its head tilted in an unnaturally curious gesture. Emily's heart stopped. She grabbed the man's arm, pulling him forward with renewed urgency. "It's watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to keep moving." They broke into a clumsy run, branches whipping against their faces, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The forest seemed alive with hostility, each tree, each shadow a potential harbors of the horrific creatures stalking them. Suddenly, Emily's foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling into the snow. Her flashlight skittered away, spinning erratically and casting wild shadows before it flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness. Panic overwhelmed her as she scrambled in the snow, her hands searching desperately for the flashlight. But her fingers found something else, rough, cold, and metallic. It was a trap, likely left by hunters. A surge of hope rose within her. If she could set it up, it might give them a chance. With shaking hands, Emily worked to arm the trap, setting it in the path they had been following. Her fingers numb from the cold, she barely managed to cock the mechanism before dragging the injured man behind a large tree, where they huddled together, waiting. The howls were all around them now, a terrifying cacophony that seemed to come from every direction. The weight was excrucifying, every rustle of wind sounding like the approach of their hunters. Then, a sudden snap echoed through the forest, followed by a ghastly shriek. The trap had sprung. Run! Emily didn't know if the trap had caught a Wendigo or merely an animal, but she wasn't about to wait to find out. Helping the man to his feet, they ran as fast as their weary bodies would allow. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees never ending. Emily's mind was filled with dread, expecting at any moment to feel the cold grip of a Wendigo's hand. But they pushed forward, driven by the pure instinct to survive, the trap and their pursuer behind them offering a grim reminder of what awaited should they falter. As dawn began to creep into the sky, a faint light filtered through the trees. They were reaching the edge of the forest, the first signs of the village visible through the thinning trees. Hope surged within Emily, propelling her forward. But the howls still echoed behind them, a haunting reminder that their ordeal might not be over. As they emerged from the tree line, the early morning light washing over them, Emily dared to look back. What she saw in the growing light of dawn was a silhouette, tall and gaunt, watching from the darkness of the forest edge. Her breath caught in her throat as she faced forward again, the village ahead offering sanctuary, yet the image of the looming, sinister figure etched itself into her memory, a stark reminder of the horror lurking just beyond. The village seemed almost surreal in its peacefulness compared to the nightmarish escape through the woods. The first villagers to spot Emily and the injured man approached rapidly, their faces etched with concern and surprise. They helped them to the village doctor, who was shocked at their frostbitten appearance and the severity of the man's injuries. As Emily sat in the warm doctor's office, her body began to thaw, but her mind remained frozen, caught in the terror of the night. She relayed their ordeal to the doctor and the few villagers who had gathered, her voice barely a whisper, the words tumbling out disjointed and frantic. "You've seen the Wendigo," one of the villagers whispered, his voice a mixture of fear and fascination. Murmurs filled the room, a blend of disbelief and terror. The doctor, a rational man, dismissed the tales as delirium brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. "Let's focus on treating these wounds and getting you both warmed up," he insisted, directing his attention to the physical injuries. But Emily knew what she had seen and felt. It was no hallucination, no trick of the mind brought on by fear. The Wendigo was real, and it was out there. As the day passed, the man Emily had saved regained his strength and shared his story. His name was Thomas, and he was a hunter from another distant village, one that had also whispered of the Wendigo. He had ventured out, skeptical yet curious, after hearing tales similar to what the Martins had told Emily. "I thought it was just a legend, a story to scare children," Thomas admitted, his eyes shadowed with the weight of his encounter. "But now, I know better. It's a warning against the greed and desperation that can consume us." Word of their return and the tale they told spread through the village like wildfire. The night fell again, and with it, an oppressive unease settled over the community. Families huddled together, and the village patrols were doubled, eyes nervously scanning the forest line that seemed to encroach closer in the dark. Emily couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were haunted by the image of the Wendigo's glowing eyes, the sound of its howl, and the deep, primal fear it had instilled in her. She lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, half expecting to hear the bone-chilling screams of the Wendigo. Needing air and feeling suffocated by the small room, Emily stepped outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. The village was quiet, too quiet, and as she walked towards the edge of the village, her gaze was drawn irresistibly to the forest. The moon, nearly full, cast a pale light over the snow, giving the forest edge an eerie, ethereal glow. And then she saw it. Not the Wendigo, but tracks. Large, humanoid footprints that led from the forest and circled the village before disappearing back into the trees. A cold dread filled her, and she knew, despite the doctor's reassurances and the skeptical looks of some villagers, that the threat was real. The Wendigo was still out there, watching, waiting. Its legend was no mere story, it was a palpable, terrifying reality that they had all underestimated. Determined to protect the village and uncover the truth, Emily approached the village elders the next morning. "We need to do something," she insisted, her voice firm. "We can't let fear rule us, but we must be prepared." Reluctantly, the elders agreed to organize more extensive patrols and to take precautions to safeguard the village. Emily, with Thomas's help, decided to delve deeper into the lore of the Wendigo, hoping to find some clue, some way to protect themselves against the creature's next inevitable appearance. As they pored over old texts and interviewed more villagers, the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly fit together. The Wendigo wasn't just a monster, it was a manifestation of the darkest parts of human nature, a physical embodiment of the starvation and cannibalism that had once plagued their ancestors during the harshest winters. But more unsettling discoveries lay ahead. As Emily and Thomas gathered information, they began to realize that the Wendigo's increased activity might be linked to something else, something more sinister than they had imagined. The signs pointed to an old, forgotten ritual, one that promised to bring forth the Wendigo itself. Armed with this new knowledge, they planned to venture back into the forest, back to where it all began. The elders were fearful, the villagers anxious, but Emily and Thomas knew that understanding the creature was their only chance to end the cycle of fear. As they prepared for their journey into the heart of darkness, the village felt the weight of the impending expedition. Everyone sensed that the confrontation was inevitable and the outcome uncertain. Emily and Thomas gathered supplies, their faces set with a resolve born of necessity. They would head out at dawn, the village's hopes and fears resting heavily on their shoulders. The night before their departure was restless for everyone in the village. Whispers filled the air, a mixture of prayers and warnings, as families held each front as though it could be their last. Emily spent the night poring over her notes, the ancient texts laying out sprawling before her on the small table of her room. The candlelight flickered, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the walls, mirroring the turmoil in her mind. In the texts, the ritual spoke of a balance between the natural world and the spiritual, a harmony disrupted by greed and desperation. The Wendigo, as the legend went, was nature's retribution, a punishment for those who succumbed to their darkest urges. But there was more to the story, hints of a forgotten ceremony that could appease the Wendigo, a ritual that required understanding and respect for the forces of nature. Thomas knocked softly on her door as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. "It's time," he said, his voice low and steady despite the palpable tension. They stepped out into the cold morning air, their breaths visible in the pale light. The village was silent, the inhabitants watching from their windows, the weight of silent farewells hanging heavy in the air. Emily and Thomas made their way to the edge of the village, where the forest began. The trees stood tall and foreboding, their branches like the twisted arms of spirits reaching out to the sky. As they entered the forest, the darkness closed around them. The path was narrow and overgrown, the underbrush thick with the remnants of fallen leaves and the hardy frost-resistant undergrowth of late autumn. Every step seemed to take them deeper into another world, a realm where the whisper of the trees carried the memories of 1,000 winters. They walked for hours, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional distant call of a bird. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the chill seeping into their bones. The sky, visible only in patches through the thick canopy, turned a steely grey, the clouds hanging low and ominous. Suddenly, Thomas stopped, holding up his hand for silence. Emily listened, her heart pounding in her ears. There it was again, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something moving through the underbrush. Not a deer, nor any small forest creature, but something heavier, deliberate in its stealth. They moved off the path, taking cover behind a large fallen log. Peering over, they saw it, a figure moving through the trees, its movements oddly disjointed, as if it were both lumbering and fluid at the same time. As it came into a small clearing, they could see it more clearly, the Wendigo. It was taller than any man, its body gaunt to the point of emaciation, its skin pale and stretched taut over protruding bones. Its eyes were sunken, dark holes that seemed to absorb the light. But it was the creature's antlers that were most striking, massive and twisted. They seemed to branch off into the trees themselves. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Here was the creature of legend, the embodiment of the Wendigo, and it was terrifyingly real. She reached slowly for her camera, her hands trembling as she aimed it at the creature, documenting its every move. The Wendigo paused, its head tilting as if it sensed their presence. Emily held her breath, praying they remained unseen. After a moment, the creature moved on, disappearing into the trees. They waited for what felt like an eternity before they dared to move. Once they felt it was safe, they continued their journey, following the trail the Wendigo had taken. It led them deeper into the forest, to a part of the woods neither had ventured before. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees denser. The path became more difficult to navigate, the underbrush thicker and more entangled. They had to be close now, close to the heart of the Wendigo's domain, where the ritual could be performed. But as they prepared to move forward, the forest around them erupted in howls. Not just one this time, but many, echoing through the trees, surrounding them. The Wendigo was not alone, and now, its brethren were aware of their presence. Emily and Thomas looked at each other, fear and determination etched on their faces. They were in the heart of darkness, the Wendigo's territory, and they had to be ready for what was to come. As they set up a small makeshift camp, preparing for what they knew would be a confrontation, the howls continued, a haunting symphony that promised a night of terrors. The legend of the Wendigo was no longer just a tale to be told, it was their stark reality, and the night ahead held the weight of their very survival. As darkness settled over the forest like a suffocating blanket, Emily and Thomas prepared for what they knew would be their most dangerous hours. The cold seeped through their clothing, chilling their bones as they huddled together by a small fire they dared to keep lit only for warmth. The howls of the Wendigo surrounded them, now close, now distant, a psychological torment that tested their resolve. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves tightened the knot of fear in their stomachs. They spoke little, conserving their energy, their eyes darting into the dark, trying to penetrate the complete blackness that enveloped them. Emily revisited the ritual steps in her mind, the ancient text's guidance clear but daunting. They needed to draw the Wendigo into a circle of ancient stones located somewhere to the north of their current position. The stones, the text had said, were placed by the original inhabitants of the land, a people who had known how to live in harmony with nature and its darker elements. Finding the strength in their purpose, Emily and Thomas extinguished their fire before first light, leaving the cold to envelop them completely. They moved stealthily, guided by the faint glow of the approaching dawn, their senses on high alert. As the sky began to lighten, they found the circle of stones, just as the texts had described. The stones were large, covered with moss and the etchings of a forgotten language, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, a flat stone altar seemed to await their ritual. Emily and Thomas quickly set about preparing, placing the items they had brought from the village according to the ritual instructions: herbs, bones, and small tokens from the villagers, each a symbol of peace and coexistence. As they worked, the forest around them grew eerily silent, the howls ceasing, as if the Wendigo were watching, waiting. With the circle prepared, Emily began to recite the words from the ancient text, her voice steady but her hands trembling. The language was old, its pronunciation unfamiliar, but she spoke with conviction, feeling the weight of each syllable in the air. As she chanted, a wind began to rise, the leaves rustling as if in response to her voice. The air within the circle seemed to shimmer, the boundaries between their world and another thinning. Then, with a suddenness that took their breath away, the Wendigos appeared at the edge of the circle. There were 3 of them, their gaunt forms horrifying yet mesmerizing. Thomas stood by Emily, his own voice joining in the chant, his presence a pillar of strength. The creatures stepped closer, their movements hesitant, as if the power of the ritual held them at bay. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. Emily and Thomas poured all their energy into the words, the air around them crackling with power. The Wendigos circled the stone ring, their eyes glowing, their breaths visible in the cold morning air. Then, as the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, illuminating the circle with a golden light, the Wendigos stopped. They stood still, their heads bowed, as if in reverence or defeat. Emily's voice rose for the final invocation, a plea for peace and understanding, for the breaking of the cycle of fear and violence. As she spoke the last word, a profound silence fell over the forest. The Wendigos, those terrifying creatures of legend, began to fade, their forms dissolving into the morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of their howls, now distant, now just a memory. Exhausted but elated, Emily and Thomas collapsed to the ground, the relief overwhelming. They had done it, they had faced the ancient darkness and had emerged victorious, or so it seemed. The forest around them felt lighter, the air cleaner, as if a great weight had been lifted. They made their way back to the village, the sun warming their backs, the threat of the Wendigos gone, for now. But as they left the forest, Emily looked back one last time. In the shadows of the trees, she thought she saw a movement, a reminder perhaps that some legends never truly die. They merely sleep, waiting for the circle to be broken, for the balance to shift once again. The story of the Wendigo was not over, it had merely turned a page, waiting for the next chapter to be written in the frostbitten woods where the snow whispers secrets and the winter wind mourns the lost. As Emily and Thomas approached the village, the familiar sight of smoke curling up from chimneys and the sound of morning activities brought a sense of surreal normalcy. The villagers, who had spent a restless night fearing for the safety of the pair, gathered around them, their faces a mixture of relief and awe. "We did it," Emily said to the crowd, her voice carrying a tired but triumphant tone. "The ritual worked. The Wendigos have retreated." Her words were met with a mixture of cheers and skeptical murmurs. The elders, wearing expressions of deep thought, nodded cautiously. They knew the nature of such spirits better than anyone, never truly vanquished, only appeased, for a time. Thomas, standing beside Emily, added, "We have restored balance for now, but it's a reminder that we must respect the boundaries of nature and the legends of our ancestors." The village shaman, an elderly woman with eyes as deep as the forest itself, stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of centuries. "You have done well, children of the forest. But remember, the Wendigo is not just a creature, it is a manifestation of our own greed and desperation. As long as mankind harbors these dark seeds, the threat will linger." Her words hung in the air, a solemn warning that resonated with everyone present. The villagers, now more aware of the delicate balance between their world and the darker realms, decided to institute a yearly ritual to honor the spirits of the forest and maintain the peace that Emily and Thomas had fought so hard to achieve. In the weeks that followed, Emily stayed in the village, documenting the aftermath of their encounter and the changes in the community's traditions. Her articles, when published, would bring a mix of fascination and fear to the wider world, her name synonymous with the legend she had helped to unravel. Thomas, on the other hand, found his calling in the village, deciding to learn from the shaman and help maintain the rituals that kept the darker forces at bay. His previous life as a hunter had prepared him well for a role that balanced on the edge of the natural and supernatural worlds. As for Emily, once her work was complete, she prepared to leave the village, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what still lurked in the shadows. On her last night, she took a walk to the edge of the forest, the scene of their harrowing experience. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the snow-blanketed ground. There, in the serene quiet of the winter night, Emily felt a profound connection to the forest, its beauty and its perils. She realized that her journey had changed her, had torn down the skeptical walls she had built around herself. She now understood that some mysteries were not meant to be solved completely but respected from a distance. As she turned to leave, a chill breeze whispered through the trees, a sound like a soft sigh. Emily paused, looking back at the dark forest. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, a shadowy outline with glowing eyes, watching her from the darkness. She held her breath, feeling the now familiar thrill of fear mixed with awe. But as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Emily to wonder if it had been a trick of the light or a final farewell from the forest's most elusive inhabitants. With a last look at the woods, Emily walked back to the village, the snow crunching under her boots. She carried with her the stories, the truths, and the secrets of the Wendigo, a legend that would continue to haunt and fascinate as long as the winter winds howled through the trees of the northern forests. The story of Emily and the Wendigo would live on, a chilling reminder of the thin line between man and myth, the seen and the unseen, and the eternal dance between humanity and the wild, mysterious forces of nature.